Picture this: October 1st, 1949. A man stands before the gates of the Forbidden City in Beijing, his voice carrying across Tiananmen Square to hundreds of thousands of people. Mao Zedong, at 55 years old, declares the birth of the People's Republic of China. This isn't just another political announcement. This is the moment when everything changes for nearly a quarter of the world's population. You have to understand, Mao had spent decades dreaming of this moment. Years of guerrilla warfare in the mountains, surviving the brutal long march across impossible terrain, fighting the Japanese invaders with peasant armies, battling Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalists in a devastating civil war that left millions dead, all leading to this single declaration that would reshape not just China, but the entire global balance of power. Now they called it a people's democratic dictatorship. But let me tell you what that really meant. Democracy? That was just window dressing for the international community. Real power flowed through a tight pyramid. About 100 senior party members in the Central Committee, then up to 12 in the Politburo, and finally to just 5 men in the Politburo Standing Committee where the real decisions got made behind closed doors. Among these 5, you had some absolutely fascinating characters. There was Liu Shaoqi, this veteran labor organizer who'd studied revolutionary theory in Moscow, now Mao's vice chairman and heir apparent. Then Zhou Enlai, charming as they come, a diplomatic genius with impeccable manners who'd actually outranked Mao in the early days, but had the political wisdom to step aside and pledge his unwavering loyalty. And at the very top, Mao himself, not naturally gifted as a public speaker, often mumbling in his thick Hunanese dialect, but possessing this magnetic presence and intellectual depth that could inspire millions to follow him to their deaths. Behind Mao stood his 4th wife, Jiang Qing, a former Shanghai actress with a personality as powerful and ruthless as her husband's. Beautiful, intelligent, fiercely protective, and absolutely unforgiving toward anyone she perceived as a threat to Mao's authority. This woman would prove to be one of the most influential figures in Chinese politics for decades to come. But here's what struck me most about those early days. China was completely broken, absolutely shattered. After decades of warlord conflicts, foreign invasion, and civil war, the country was on its knees economically and socially. Every 5th person on Earth was a Chinese peasant, and most of them were living in conditions that hadn't changed since medieval times. Landless, illiterate, surviving on the edge of starvation. So what did the communists do? They got to work immediately, fast, systematic, and brutally efficient. 10,000 Soviet advisors poured into the country, bringing Stalin's detailed blueprint for socialist revolution. Technical experts, political commissars, economic planners, all ready to transform this ancient civilization into a modern communist state. The first target? The landlords who'd controlled rural China for centuries, through a feudal system that kept peasants in perpetual debt and dependency. What happened next was both transformative and absolutely horrifying to witness. Public trials in village squares, mass denunciations, complete social upheaval. Landlords who had dominated their communities for generations suddenly found themselves dragged before angry crowds of their former tenants. The accusations flew: exploitation, abuse, corruption, collaboration with foreign enemies. Over 1 million landowners were executed in those early years, their property seized and redistributed among the peasants who had worked it for generations without owning a single acre. Within 3 years, 300 million peasants owned land for the first time in their lives. Think about that number for a moment. 300 million people suddenly having something they'd never dreamed possible. The psychological impact was enormous. These weren't just economic reforms, this was a complete transformation of rural consciousness. But the communists didn't stop there. They revolutionized women's rights, giving them legal equality and protecting their role in the workforce. They simplified the Chinese writing system to boost literacy from a pathetic 20%, making education accessible to the masses. Massive propaganda campaigns filled theaters, public squares, and factory walls with revolutionary messages designed to both educate and indoctrinate. Traditional class structures that had defined Chinese society for millennia crumbled overnight. Wealthy merchant families, educated elites, former government officials, they all found themselves publicly humiliated, their fortunes confiscated, their social status destroyed. The psychological pressure was so intense that some couldn't bear the shame and took their own lives rather than face continued persecution. Suspected counter-revolutionaries were everywhere, or so it seemed. Nationalist sympathizers, corrupt officials, capitalists, intellectuals with foreign connections, anyone could be denounced, investigated, and eliminated. The campaigns created an atmosphere of constant fear and suspicion that would define Chinese society for decades. Meanwhile, the world was rapidly choosing sides in the emerging Cold War. The Western powers wouldn't even recognize Communist China, still backing Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan as the legitimate ruler of all China. The Americans, British, and French saw Mao as just another Soviet puppet, a dangerous extension of Stalin's empire in Asia. So Mao had nowhere to turn but Moscow, despite his deep personal reservations about Soviet interference in Chinese affairs. December 1949 found Mao in Stalin's Russia, spending 3 freezing months in brutal negotiations. These two communist titans didn't trust each other one bit. Stalin saw Mao as an upstart peasant revolutionary, while Mao resented Soviet attempts to control Chinese policy. But they needed each other desperately. The result? A friendship treaty signed in February 1950 that would define geopolitics for decades. Economic cooperation, military assistance, technological transfer, the alliance promised to transform China's capabilities while extending Soviet influence across Asia. But Mao wasn't content with just controlling mainland China. He wanted the old Qing Empire back, all those territories that had slipped away during the chaos following the 1911 revolution. His armies marched into Xinjiang in 1949, meeting little resistance in that remote western province. Then came Tibet in 1951, after what the Chinese euphemistically called peaceful liberation, which involved plenty of tanks, artillery, and very little actual peace. The Dalai Lama was allowed to remain as a figurehead, heading a local government that existed only at Beijing's pleasure. Outer Mongolia was a different story entirely. Firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence, and Mao wasn't ready to challenge Stalin directly over that territory. But Taiwan remained the great prize, the symbol of unfinished revolution that gnawed at Mao constantly. Then came Korea, and everything escalated dramatically. June 1950. North Korean forces smashed across the 38th parallel like a hurricane, capturing Seoul within a week and pushing South Korean forces to the very tip of the peninsula. This wasn't just another regional conflict. This was the Cold War turning hot, with both superpowers backing their respective allies. When UN forces, led by the Americans under General MacArthur, landed at Incheon and pushed back toward the Chinese border, Mao faced the most terrifying decision of his life. American forces right on his doorstep? American bombers within striking distance of Beijing? Absolutely unthinkable. The response was massive and immediate. Over 1 million Chinese volunteer troops poured across the Yalu River into Korea, eventually rising to 2.5 million soldiers. They came in human waves, often poorly equipped but incredibly determined, willing to absorb enormous casualties to push back the technologically superior UN forces. The human cost was absolutely staggering. Over 500,000 Chinese casualties, possibly many more. Among the dead was Mao's own son, Mao Anying, killed in a UN airstrike while serving as a Russian translator with Chinese forces. For Mao, this wasn't just war. It was deeply, painfully personal. The Korean War finally ended in stalemate in 1953, with both sides exhausted and dug in along the heavily fortified demilitarized zone. But for China, it was a victory of sorts. They'd stood up to the mighty American superpower and lived to tell about it. Communist legitimacy at home soared, even as the Americans imposed a complete trade embargo that would isolate China economically for decades. By 1953, flush with confidence from their Korean performance, China launched its first five-year plan, copying the Soviet model of centralized economic planning. The results were genuinely impressive in heavy industry. Coal, steel, iron production all exceeded ambitious targets. China became a major oil producer for the first time in its history. Massive infrastructure projects, built with Soviet technical assistance, began connecting the country's vast distances. But the real ambition was agricultural transformation through collectivization on a massive scale. Farmers who had just received their own land were now forced into cooperatives. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of families sharing everything: land, tools, harvest, work assignments, and increasingly, their very thoughts and political opinions. By 1956, 80% of peasant households belonged to these cooperatives, which served both economic and ideological purposes. The cooperatives weren't just about farming efficiency, they were about control. Party committees could monitor every aspect of rural life, from who married whom to what people said in private conversations. Centuries of rural tradition and family autonomy were being obliterated at breakneck speed. Encouraged by these apparent successes, Mao made a fateful decision in 1956 that would reveal the true limits of communist tolerance. "Let 100 flowers bloom," he declared with apparent magnanimity. "Let 100 schools of thought contend." He wanted fresh ideas, constructive criticism, intellectual innovation to fuel China's continued development. What he got instead was a devastating flood of complaints, criticisms, and alternative proposals from intellectuals, academics, scientists, and even party members. They criticized everything: economic policies, political repression, Soviet influence, the personality cult around Mao himself. The party leadership was absolutely stunned and furious. Instead of welcoming this democratic dialogue, they launched the vicious anti-rightist campaign, punishing at least 500,000 people deemed insufficiently loyal to the revolution. Public humiliation sessions, hard labor in remote camps, professional destruction, family separation, and for many, execution. The familiar tools of totalitarian control deployed against China's intellectual class. Leading this brutal campaign was a new face in the Politburo Standing Committee, 52-year-old Deng Xiaoping, a Long March veteran with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. This man would prove absolutely crucial in the turbulent years ahead, though few could have predicted his eventual role in Chinese history. But Mao's biggest disaster was still to come, and it would dwarf all previous tragedies. 1958 marked the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's incredibly audacious plan to catch up with the world's leading economies virtually overnight through sheer revolutionary willpower. The propaganda was absolutely intoxicating. Every Chinese citizen could help build a socialist paradise through determination, innovation, and unwavering faith in Mao's leadership. Rural cooperatives merged into gigantic people's communes, some containing over 50,000 people, where the party controlled every single aspect of daily life. Private kitchens were banned as manifestations of selfish individualism and replaced with massive communal canteens. The state owned everything, distributed everything, decided everything: when you woke up, what you ate, where you worked, who you married. What happened next ranks among history's greatest man-made disasters, and I want you to understand just how completely avoidable it all was. With most technical experts purged during the anti-rightist campaign, wildly unrealistic production targets became impossible fantasies disconnected from any economic reality. Local officials, absolutely terrified of disappointing Beijing and facing persecution themselves, began reporting completely fabricated harvest figures to their superiors. These inflated numbers convinced central planners that there was massive surplus grain in the countryside, which they then seized from communes to feed the cities and export abroad for foreign currency. Meanwhile, farmers were forced to abandon agriculture entirely to build backyard furnaces and produce worthless iron instead of growing desperately needed food. The result was catastrophic famine on an unimaginable scale. Recent historical research suggests the Great Leap Forward killed at least 45 million people, 7% of China's entire population in just a few short years. In the worst-hit areas, entire communes starved to death, while their leaders continued reporting record harvests. The winter of 1960 became perhaps the darkest, most desperate period in all of Chinese history. When Defense Minister Peng Dehuai courageously criticized Mao at the 1959 Lushan Conference, pointing out the obvious failures and calling for policy changes, he was immediately placed under house arrest and replaced by the utterly loyal General Lin Biao. The message was clear: even constructive criticism from the highest levels would not be tolerated. But eventually, even Mao couldn't ignore the mounting evidence of complete catastrophe. Reports of widespread death, social collapse, and economic destruction finally penetrated the party's information bubble. By 1961, reality forced acknowledgement of serious mistakes. Mao stepped back from day-to-day governance, allowing more pragmatic leaders like Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, and Deng Xiaoping to take control and begin damage control. Some of the most disastrous reforms were quietly reversed. Communes were reduced in size, communal canteens were abandoned, limited private ownership returned to desperate farmers. But make no mistake, the party's fundamental grip on daily life remained absolutely total, controlling everything from healthcare to housing, education to employment, with food remaining strictly rationed for years to come. Interestingly, 1958 also saw the adoption of pinyin, a new phonetic alphabet designed to encourage literacy throughout China. Suddenly, familiar place names began changing. Peking became Beijing, Canton became Guangzhou, Nanking became Nanjing. These changes spread slowly within China itself and weren't adopted internationally until the 1980s, creating decades of confusion in Western reporting. While managing domestic disasters, Mao grew increasingly aggressive in international affairs, perhaps hoping foreign victories could restore his damaged prestige. August 1958 saw Chinese artillery bombarding nationalist-held islands in the Taiwan Strait, testing both Chiang Kai-shek's defenses and American resolve. The American response was swift and nuclear. They sent massive naval reinforcements and explicitly threatened to use atomic weapons if necessary to defend Taiwan. It was one of the world's first serious nuclear crises, bringing the superpowers to the brink of atomic war over these tiny, strategically insignificant islands. This recklessness absolutely infuriated Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who was pursuing a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West and détente with the Americans. The relationship between the world's two great communist powers began its fatal, irreversible deterioration. When Khrushchev courageously denounced Stalin's cult of personality in 1956, revealing the full extent of Soviet purges and terror, Mao was personally outraged. He saw this as a complete betrayal of true communist principles, evidence that the Soviets had gone soft and abandoned the revolutionary struggle. The ideological split became unbridgeable. After 1959, Mao and Khrushchev never met again, and their personal animosity poisoned relations between their countries for decades. That same year brought a major revolt against Chinese rule in Tibet, as traditional leaders and ordinary Tibetans rose up against communist control. Chinese artillery shelled the holy city of Lhasa, crushing the uprising after 3 days of bloody street fighting that destroyed ancient monasteries and killed thousands of civilians. The Dalai Lama and 80,000 Tibetans fled across the treacherous Himalayan passes to India, leaving Tibet under direct Chinese military rule. Any pretense of Tibetan autonomy was abandoned, and Han Chinese settlers began arriving to permanently alter the region's demographics. 1962 saw border fighting with India as China grabbed disputed Himalayan territory in a brief but decisive war. Most tellingly, the Soviet Union backed India over China. a clear sign of how completely the Communist alliance had collapsed. The Soviets had already withdrawn all technical support for Chinese weapons programs, leaving China to develop its military capabilities independently. But China was finding its own technological path with remarkable success. The 1958 founding of the University of Science and Technology in Beijing symbolized growing self-reliance in advanced research. Chinese scientists, many educated abroad before the revolution, began achieving breakthrough after breakthrough. Then came the moment that announced China's arrival as a true world power. October 16, 1964, at the remote Lop Nor testing site in Xinjiang province, China successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. The mushroom cloud that rose over the desert announced that the world had changed forever. 2 years later came the hydrogen bomb, demonstrating China's rapid mastery of the most advanced military technology. China had joined the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and France as the world's fifth nuclear power, adopting a no-first-use policy that distinguished it from the superpowers and reflected Mao's view that nuclear weapons were tools of deterrence rather than aggression. There was absolutely no question now. China stood on its own feet as a major world power, independent of both Soviet and American influence. The broken, feudal nation of 1949 had become a nuclear-armed communist state capable of challenging either superpower. But for Mao and the Communist Party, this was just the beginning of their revolutionary project. Their next battleground would be Chinese society itself, targeting not just economic structures, but the very thoughts and cultural values of nearly 1 billion people. What was coming would make everything that had happened so far seem like preparation for an even greater transformation. The metamorphosis was complete. From a shattered, semi-colonial society to an independent nuclear power in just 15 years. The human cost had been absolutely staggering, with tens of millions dead from war, famine, and political persecution. But the geopolitical impact was undeniable and permanent. China had returned to the world stage as a major power, and nothing in international relations would ever be quite the same again.